My name is Eric Elliott, and I'm the Advanced Hunter Education Coordinator with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And tonight we're going to be talking falconry. And if you don't know what that is, you're not alone. I was telling the guys earlier, and nearly 28 years as a wildlife officer, I've never seen a falconer in the field. So I've either been patrolling the wrong spots or maybe hitting the donut shops too much. I'm not sure, but I am looking forward to learning more about this tonight. And I think that's one of the cool things about hunting is that we never have just like a rut. We just keep learning and growing. And so tonight we have with us Butch Koga, Derek Thrasher, and Mike McKinnon. So Mike is going to be behind the scenes answering some questions as they come in. And I just want to say in advance before we get going, thank you so much, guys. Thanks so much for coming on and serving the hunting public. So go ahead and take it away, Derek.
Absolutely. Yeah, just confirm that you can see the screen.
Yes, sir. I've got it.
All right. Great. Well, let's go ahead and dive into it. Yeah, so Butch and I would like to chat with everyone tonight about falconry, really the ancient art of hunting with birds of prey. And it really is one of our most ancient hunting techniques, sport, art, whatever you want to call it. Tonight, we're going to cover just a quick introduction about myself and also Butch, give you a little bit of an overview about the history of falconry, what it takes to become a falconer in California, and then we'll talk about the kind of process of going from trapping a raptor and then through the training and ultimately the end goal hunting with a raptor. And then we'll chat a little bit about the role of falconry in conservation. And then lastly, just wrap it up with any Q&A and final thoughts that you guys might have. So let's go ahead and dive on in. So my name is Derek Thrasher. I have just about 4 years of active falconry experience. I say active falconry experience because as anyone that is a falconer knows, there's a lot of experience that goes into it prior to even becoming a licensed falconer. So I am about just under 2 years into my general class falconry permit. So I went through an apprenticeship, which we'll talk about later, and then progressed to the second class, the general class, recently. And I worked with American kestrels mostly through my apprenticeship. Since I've become a general, I now have a young male Harris's hawk that I trained and hunted with this past season. I've also worked with red-tailed hawks, kind of ancillary, and Cooper's hawk. So we can see that in the photos here. We have my Harris's hawk on the top with a bunny we caught last year. And then I'm really interested in dog work because I'm also an upland game hunter. And so I have a couple French Brittany's that I've worked with and worked with them with Cooper's hawks. And so that's really some of my main interests is like upland game, waterfowl, rabbits and jackrabbits, and ultimately putting that whole team together to complete the whole cycle. So with that, I'll hand it over to Butch to introduce himself.
How you doing? My name is Butch Koga. I guess I'm the old guy here. So I've been a falconer since I was 14, and I am 67 years of age now. And over the years, I have pretty much flown every type of bird. I have flown long wings, accipiters, and I've got a pair of Harris hawks like what Derek is flying right now. But let's see, in the long wing division, I have flown multiple prairie falcons, peregrine falcons, accipiters. I have flown Cooper's hawks and quite a few goshawks. I've flown red tails, and these Harris hawks are my first Harris hawks I've had now for 7 years, and having a lot of fun with them. But yeah, so I got my master class license now for quite a few years, and doing a lot of help getting new apprentices into the sport that are really interested in it, and I like to involve myself with them, which has been a big source of whatever you want to call it, fulfillment for me. And
Okay,
that's
Butch,
about
I've got
it.
a question. I've got a question for you, buddy. At
Sure.
age 14, how in the wide world did you get involved into falconry when you're
So I was driving with my dad and I saw a young guy walking down the street with a gloved hand and a falcon on his hand. And I just made my dad stop the car and I ran out and I picked this guy's brain on how I can become a falconer and get a bird like that. And he ended up becoming a lifelong friend. And he helped me go through the ropes of doing all that's needed. We'll explain a little bit later of what it takes to get a license. But I had never really seen a bird of prey up close before, and it just won me over. I was sold from that point on, and I've been just engrossed in them ever since.
awesome?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think a lot of uh, falconers that came up in like the 80s, 90s too. My side of the mountain and reading about Peregrine in that book. Like,
Absolutely.
that's how I first came to it, and then had to wait until I was out of graduate school and a little bit more settled down because one of the things that Butch and I will both mention tonight is that falconry really is a lifestyle. So it's a hunting method, a sport, but it is also a lifestyle. We put so much work and dedication into the health and happiness of our birds, and just really trying to put in as much work as we can during all the hunting seasons for all the different
True.
game that we go
You know,
after.
and what helped me as a 14-year-old is I had very supportive parents that, of
Mm.
course, they knew nothing about falconry or birds of prey. And my mom wasn't thrilled about a lot of things that she had to witness, but they were so supportive of me. And that really helped me launch.
Yep.
Awesome.
Well, thanks. Well, we're great to have everyone here, and we appreciate you guys listening to the talk. Um, we'll go ahead and dive in and talk a little bit more about what falconry actually is, and hopefully teach you a few new things tonight. So, at its like very basic level, falconry is defined as the taking of wild quarry in its natural state and habitat by means of a trained raptor. And what I think is really cool about this is that the part that I've underlined there, the taking of wild quarry in its natural state and habitat, that happens all the time with or without us. The falcons, hawks are always trying to hunt and do their own thing, but where it really comes into play with the falconer and the partnership there is that training and developing that trust and that working relationship. So wild raptors, which we'll talk about, captive bred raptors, anything like that. At any point in time when we're out hunting in the field, those birds could decide to go and do their own thing. And sometimes they do, but we really work hard to develop that trust and that working relationship and make it mutually beneficial for both the bird and the hunter. All right. So let's go ahead and just give you a quick overview about the history of falconry. So we have evidence of falconry going back over 4,000 years in the Middle East, Mongolia, Egypt, and it largely really started out as a way to get food and did develop into a sport as well. It does take a lot of knowledge and practice, so it really is ultimately a sport, but originated mostly for food. And the practice of falconry grew, changed pretty widely, spread across Asia. A lot of the Arab countries where falconry was practiced early on actually saw quite a bit of resurgence as we move more toward our modern era. And I just love this kind of stuff, especially with falconry being so ancient. We have lots of examples in our cultural and artistic representations of falconry because it truly was a lifestyle then as it is now. So we can see some Iranian petroglyphs there, this silver vessel depicting someone with a falcon sitting on their fist, as well as I love the image on the right showing a falcon on a leash, which we'll talk about that when we get to the equipment. And then as we get closer to modern day, in the 5th century, falconry was pretty much at that point in time firmly entrenched throughout Europe. We have lots of evidence through quotations from a number of French scholars, as well as some famous mosaics at the Falconers Villa in Greece. And so through the Middle Ages, falconry really spread. It was still pretty practiced as a way to get food, did develop into a bit more of a sport, and then became much more of a status symbol. So during the Renaissance, 1200s through 1500s, falconry was widely practiced in Europe by European nobility, and was really seen as someone who was high status and able to fly their birds. And then as we started to adopt firearms a little bit more for hunting, and our hunting methods changed, the practice of falconry really declined pretty steeply and was just practiced by a few number of individuals. But as we approach the current century, and even the previous century, we really saw a revival of falconry in a lot of countries. So, of course, falconry, I feel like, has been very well practiced through a lot of the Middle Eastern countries and held that cultural importance. But in some European countries, it really resurged, and it actually came to North America in the 1900s. And we also have cultural heritage recognition now for falconry. So it is a culturally relevant sport. So we have really cool protections for the sport in that way as well. So the archives of falconry is in, I think, right around Boise, Idaho. I can't remember the small town that it's located in, but they have done a wonderful job of protecting, learning, and acquiring as much as they can to really show the history of falconry. And they have this mural on their website. I actually invite you to go check it out, because there's actually a second half that I don't have on here. And I do believe they have this in person somewhere at the Archives of Falconry. So what's really important for us in the talk today is falconry in the United States and how we got to where we are. So we didn't have evidence of Native American peoples practicing falconry prior to European colonization. But in the 18th and 19th century, while falconry is rare, there were some individuals in Mexico, New England, that were practicing. And then around the 1920s, National Geographic magazine actually put out an article called Falconry, the Sport of Kings, and it really got people excited about falconry, and it started to grow much more after World War II. Prior to World War II, there were only 200 falconers in the US, so it was really not a widely practiced sport. And then in the 1950s and 60s, and closer to when Butch was becoming a falconer, it really evolved into a regulated sport.
The good old days.
Yeah, that had to have been really fun. I do actually wish I had seen that. But the North American Falconers Association, also known as NAFA, was formed in the early 60s. And there was a lot of focus at that time on the decline of raptors. And we'll talk about this at the end of the talk too, but the Peregrine Fund was one of the early things that was created to help curb the decline of raptors, and led to some really cool partnerships between falconers, conservationists, and legislators. So as we grew falconry in California, the federal and state regulations really became cemented in the 60s and 70s. State falconry clubs were formed. We can see here that the California Hawking Club was formed here in California. And so adopted a standard set of falconry guidelines that all these groups work to put into play. And our host today, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, alongside California Hawking Club, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, really work together to administer and enforce our falconry regulations in California. As I mentioned, California Hawking Club, or CHC, was formed in 1971, and they work in partner with Fish and Wildlife. And so just quickly, I want to paraphrase these. These are directly from California Hawking Club. Just the purpose of our organization is really to improve the qualifications and abilities of falconers, disseminate knowledge through meetings, research, papers, publications, promote a good public image of falconry, to have falconry viewed as both an art and a sport, and preserve it for future generations, and the preservation of all birds of prey through education and public outreach. So as falconry really was cemented in North America, North American falconers really contributed a lot to the evolution of falconry since the resurgence in the 1900s. So 5 of our 6 major advances in modern falconry originated in North America. One being development of captive breeding techniques for both use in the sport and for conservation. Another really awesome and one that we use very commonly when we hunt our birds is the development of radio telemetry. So we have transmitters that we attach to the birds in a number of different methods. It's a little out of the scope of the talk today, but just to know that we do have methods to attach these transmitters. So if a bird were to get lost, we can responsibly recover that bird and improve our training methods. A lot of you, if you're familiar with falconry or ever seen a falcon or a hawk at a public outreach or at a Renaissance fair or anything like that, may have noticed the hood that's on the falcon or hawk's head. And so we had the development of the American hood using thinner leather and a more naturally contoured opening around the beak of the raptor. And then also more work and research on a very bad illness for raptors, and some species more so than others, frounce. We were able to discover the cause and then a cure for that disease. And then one of the coolest things is the introduction, I think it's the coolest thing, introduction of the red-tailed hawk and the Harris's hawk into international falconry, 2 birds that have really revolutionized how we practice falconry overall worldwide.
Why is that cool? Derek, tell us about that.
Yeah, so red-tailed hawks and Harris's hawks, so if you recall from the video we saw with the falcon, they have a much different hunting style. So not so much of the pursuit and stoop. We actually use red-tailed hawks and Harris's hawks often in what's called dirt hawking. So more like very good slips where they can get something without a long pursuit, and gives us just more of an ability of game to hunt. And then the Harris's hawks as well, they're a social hawk. So they're kind of often referred to as like the wolves of the sky. So introduced more of an ability to hunt with multiple hawks in what's called a cast. And so they just really changed how we actually hunt with the birds. I don't know if Butch, you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, they were brought in as a supplement. You know, back in the old days, in the early 80s, I flew only long-winged birds, with the peregrine or prairie falcons. But even by the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, all of our land was being developed here. And to truly fly a long-winged bird, which is actually one of my favorite things to do, it was unmanageable. You couldn't find the right fields. We would most long-winged birds, you're hunting feather, and duck was the most common thing around here. So we would always hunt duck with our long wings. But as our land got eaten up, it's not even practical in lots of parts of Southern California to hunt longwing anymore. And these Harris hawks and these red-tailed hawks made falconry still a way of getting out there and hunting with a bird. And now we're going for more land based animals, rabbits and squirrels and things. But back then they were just everywhere. So we were having a field day with red tails and Harris hawks, back in the day.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah. And Butch and I have talked about this a lot. Harris's hawks are pretty versatile in what they'll hunt. So they excel on fur quarry, but they also do really well on certain feather quarry. So they're pretty versatile.
Yeah, and to be honest, these are the first Harris hawks I've ever owned. I have a pair in over 50 years of falconry. Um, they get kind of frowned upon because these are actually the smartest birds of prey I've ever worked with. They're very intelligent and they're very personable. And so they're considered a beginner's hawk. And so a lot of falconers in the
Wow.
day shied away from them. But I'll tell you, I have, in my older age, it's so much fun to have these birds because they literally follow you in the field just naturally. And the chances of losing them are pretty rare. And they're just they're a fun bird. All the other birds, the falcons, the goshawks, they're very temperamental birds. They're very they could turn on you on a dime. Where these birds are just very docile, very well behaved, and easily trained birds. So they get a bad rep because they are so smart.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. Great question. And then our sixth really major advance is kind of across the pond, but it's really an important thing for us. The development of the Elamary Jess, and everybody says it a little bit differently, but historically, the anklet, which you see on the left there in image 6, and the Jess, which is on the right, were all one piece that were around the raptor's leg. That development of that particular type of Jess, which we'll show and talk about a little bit later, allows the Jess to go through the anklet. And if a bird were to get lost, it can get that Jess out, and then gives it a better chance of making sure it doesn't get caught on anything. And then eventually the leather will degrade on the anklet and the bird is free of anything and is safe. All right. So that just gives us a quick overview on the history. So hopefully, if you want any more information, I invite you to go to the Archives of Falconry. There's lots of great stuff there, as well as from NAFA. But I'm sure that a lot of you are really interested in what it takes to become a falconer in California. So first, I wanted to talk about some general requirements. And these are developed from regulations from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as California Department of Fish and Wildlife, with a big focus on our Migratory Bird Treaty Act, because a general public citizen is not allowed to possess a wild bird that's protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And falconers are treated a little bit differently there because we go through such a rigorous process to ensure that we are able to do what we have to for the sport, as well as we'll talk about some ways that we actually benefit the raptor populations through some of the birds that we catch and work with. So you do need a falconry license, which you have to renew annually. And we'll talk about these classes, but you have your apprentice, general, and master. So I'm a general, Butch is a master. You also have to have a hunting license. That's really important. That's also renewed every year. And any additional tags or permits that you need for any game that you're hunting. And then we really care about our health and the welfare of the birds. So you have to go through an inspection of your facilities and your equipment with a game warden from Fish and Wildlife. They will look at your facilities, so your housing, your mew, and your outdoor enclosure, your weathering area, as well as all the equipment that you have. So the jesses that we mentioned, leashes, which we'll show, and some other equipment. And then you do have to report every year. Falconers have to report any raptors are in your possession, so the number of birds and species, and that depends on your class. And we'll show that in just a little bit. And then each year we do have to report the wildlife that we take. And so obviously we work really hard to try to take the game that's in season and that we're going for, whether it's rabbit, quail, pheasant. But the raptors ultimately are hunting. They don't always follow the rules and regulations. So we do have a rule in place called the Let It Lie rule, which if you were to get a quarry that's outside of the season, you can still allow the bird to feed on that kill, but then leave that carcass, that quarry in the field. And then if we do accidentally take a federal or threatened or endangered species, we do have to report it to U.S. Fish and Wildlife and CDFW pretty quickly.
Also called incidental take.
Incidental take. Yep.
Right.
Thanks, Butch. Yeah. So lots of responsibility on our part. And we do try to be as responsible as we can because it really is a privilege to do what we do. And then fees. So they said it's a lifestyle. So there are inspection fees, annual licensing, annual application fees, and then as well as the housing and equipment. Lots of money goes into this.
It's funny how things have changed though, because when I started back in the mid '70s, early '70s, there was no sponsorship. You got your apprentice license for 2 years. You automatically turned general in 5. But I think I explained it, Derek. It was a field day for us back then because there was no such thing as an internet. There weren't hardly any falconers around. So it was all trial and error for us old guys because we had very little information. We had several falconry books to go off of, but that was about it back then. So things have changed way for the better.
Yeah. Yep. So I mentioned facilities, and so I'm showing you some of my facilities. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do it, and we'll talk about some of the regulations that are required. But ultimately, you need a mew, which you see there in both images, and a weathering area. So the mew is a protected area of the Raptor's chamber. Weathering area is also protected, but allows the bird to have a way to be out in the sun, out in the weather. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the requirements for that. But for most of the larger birds, you are required to have approximately an 8 foot by 8 foot mew at minimum. And then on the right is a mew that I built for my kestrels when I was in my apprenticeship. That was actually inside. Kestrels are much smaller, and you want to keep a closer eye on their weight and make sure that they're not losing too much weight, they're eating appropriately. So it's benefits to have them in the house a lot. And they are tucked in nicely. A nice mew, nice weathering area with a perch up top. And you can get away with something smaller for them. Often something 3 by 3 or even a table in the house is fine as long as they're getting all the other things that they need that we'll cover here. So just generally, no matter what bird you have to have a perch that's suitable for that species. Your mew should have a window that has suitable lighting, hopefully facing south or wherever you're getting enough lighting, and a large enough area for the raptor to fly around if it's not tethered to a perch, or if it is tethered, somewhere that it can fully extend its wings, or bait, which is what is known as the attempt to fly while tethered. So once they reach the end of their leash, they wouldn't be able to go any further than that. So we really just want to make sure we have enough space, that we keep their feathers in good shape. We're flying with them. We want them to be successful. So that's really important. And that's why a pan of clean water is also great for maintenance of feathers, as well as for a water source to drink. So the mew, typically any windows have to be covered appropriately with vertical bars that are spaced appropriately for the bird. We talked about the size a little bit there, but I just wanted to say they can really be innovative both indoors and outdoors. But even inside, they just must provide protection, ventilation, and allow for the maintenance of healthy feathers. And then the weathering area you see on mine here has a number of different perches and made of some very heavy gauge wire and wood. It is enclosed, and I have the covered perch because my mew and weathering area are directly adjoined, and I can open the door, but I will probably ultimately put a cover over the weathering area at some point as well. And then the weathering area just needs to be an appropriate size that the birds can't strike the enclosure as they're taking off from a perch. So lots of variability in what you have available. But some very general falconry equipment. We talked about the hood. The hood should be something that fits properly. They're usually made for each species. And one really interesting thing about raptors is that they are sexually dimorphic, meaning that the females are actually larger than males, so in size, and we'll see some other sexual dimorphism here in just a bit. So those have to properly fit. And certain species don't need them as much, but especially long wings, it really helps to calm them down. And here we have a Harris's hawk just illustrating a hood, but they actually do pretty well without hoods, and we'll see their transport box can be achieve the same purpose as a hood on their head. So we talked about the anklets that has a grommet, and then that's what allows the jess to connect through that grommet and through the anklet. And then if the bird were to get lost and we weren't able to retrieve it, they can pull their jesses out and not get hung up on anything. You'll notice here the jesses are actually not the traditional leather. So Butch would probably like to give me some heck for that, because he loves the traditional leather, and I actually do too. But it just wanted to illustrate that there are many different ways to make those jesses. So a lot of falconers actually braid their own out of Dacron or a similar material. So kind of already talked about the jesses. They slip through there, and they attach ultimately to the swivel, which the swivel is a piece of metal that can turn independently of each side and really just prevents that leash and the jesses from getting tangled. And then the leash is also traditionally leather, but it can be made out of a number of different ropes and other materials nowadays, and is what attaches the bird to the perch or to our glove if we're not actively hunting. And then, of course, we need a glove. Raptors have very sharp talons for a reason. That's what makes them so successful. So we need that glove appropriately sized and the appropriate thickness for the species that you're working with. And then we mentioned perches. They come in all kinds of varieties. I'm just showing you here. We have a perch that's more appropriate for a species like a red-tailed hawk on the left. They call it a bow perch, and you can see why by the shape. And then on the right, we have a block perch for a long wing. And it's just different ways that they sit on the perch, and how their natural history dictates the type of perch that we give them, what they're sitting on in the wild, and what's going to be really healthy to keep their feet in good shape and their talons in good shape. Bath pan, we already talked about that. And then we talked about telemetry and the transmitters, but we also use bells on our birds. And those help us if we have a bird that has gone down, captured something, it's in a bush or in some grass, we can't really locate it. We can hear the bells and get there closer and help them on the kill as soon as we can get there. And telemetry is really if we can't locate them in a short range.
I will say a lot of the newer falconers don't use bells, and I'm old school till the end, but bells have saved me so many times in the field where my bird just disappears, and they're usually on a rabbit, and all of a sudden I have to just listen for those bells. It prevents me from having to pull out my telemetry and hunt them down. Otherwise, I would have never found them. I think I told Derek, one of my birds, he grabs rabbits and they pull him into the rock piles, and I would have never known where he was at without those bells. So very important.
Yep, and I use them, and I have experienced some similar scenarios. And then while we're doing training, and we'll talk about the training process here a little bit, but we use what's called a creance, which is really just a way for us to attach the bird to a very long, essentially long leash, where they have more ability to fly a greater distance, but we're still confident that they're tethered to something in case something goes awry and they don't come to us during training. It's just a way to reinforce that until we're confident that they can fly free on their own. And then to that point, we also use lures, and a lot of times the lures, they can really be anything. I know Butch has said that to me many times. My sponsor as well has said the same thing. It really just has to be something that the bird identifies, knows that it's going to get a good meal from hitting that object. And so usually you have the food affixed to the lure, and it might look like something that the bird would naturally hunt. So we have a rabbit lure on the left and a pheasant lure on the right.
It literally could be an old shoe, whatever you trained your bird to. Yeah.
Yep. Through the positive reinforcement of the training methods we use, and just them knowing how they get that big reward, the lure can really be anything, which is awesome. And then I mentioned we got to get our birds out to the field, and we got to get them to the vet if there's something wrong. So you have to have a way to transport your raptor, and it can also serve as a place to keep them calm. So essentially, that's why we call it a giant hood, because the bird can go in there. It's enclosed in darkness, and achieves the same effect that you would with a regular traditional hood. So just real quickly, our permit classes. So we talked about that there's apprentice, general, and master. To be an apprentice, and we'll talk a little bit more about the apprenticeship, but you must be at least 12 years old and have parental permission. It requires a sponsor for 2 years at least, and no IS, and we'll talk about what IS and imprints are shortly, but no IS or imprint birds allowed. So during that 2 years of the apprenticeship, you need to hunt with your raptor for at least 4 months each license year, and apprentices are allowed to take red-tailed hawks or American kestrels, and they're permitted 1 bird at a time. And then to be a general, since we were able to start out pretty young, you have to be at least 16 years old to progress to that general class. And I have in here that you may sponsor an apprentice after 2 years as a general class, but I would say wait much longer because you're always getting more and more wisdom. So as a third-year general, though, you can sponsor if anybody is interested in knowing that information. And then you have to sit in your general falconer class for 5 years. And then species for general, any captive bred or hybrid falcon, hawk, or owl are permitted in any legally wild caught in California, except for eagles. And you are allowed as a general up to 3 birds, but only 2 of those can be caught in the wild. And master's pretty similar, with the exception that you can have eagles with strict guidelines. We're not going to cover those today, but you have to go through pretty rigorous process to even work with eagles as a master. And experience and advancement, there's always something to learn. So even as a master falconer, you're learning all the time. And so the species permitted are pretty much the same, except that you can possess eagles if you go through the right channels. And then for number of raptors permitted, you can have any number, but only up to 5 wild caught.
So, hey, can I back this up a little bit? Back to the equipment. The one thing that's very important that I don't know if I was asleep and you said it or not, but a scale is very important to have.
Yes. Yeah. Actually,
when the bird is hunting, we hunt our birds 6 months out of the year. In the off season, the birds are molting, so we let them get heavy. The heavier they are on the off season, the better they molt. So we let them molt, get all their new feathers in. So they're pretty much laid up. I fly my birds in the yard just to give them stretch their wings out, but usually they're pretty much laid up for 5 to 6 months. And it's not necessarily to weigh them every day in the off season, but when you're hunting them, they need to be weighed every day because you've got that sweet spot of a weight that you want them hunting at, and that can make or break your falconry day. If your bird is, especially an accipiter like a goshawk or a Cooper's hawk, they could just be a few grams overweight and you're not going to get your bird back that day. So it's very crucial to weigh your bird daily when you're hunting them.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out again. We have the scale for weighing raptors right here, but yeah, didn't have an image of it. So that's a good thing to point out. And we will be talking about weight management just a little bit here to add on to what Butch had said. So for our apprenticeship program, the steps are really study, and then take the state falconry exam. So we'll see on this slide and the next slide some resources available from the California Hawking Club that are really helpful. The study guide covers all the regulations and everything that we have to know in and out. And the passing grade is 80%, so it's fairly high. You have to acquire a hunting license, like we mentioned. And then really you need to network, shadow, and find a suitable sponsor. So it's not anybody's responsibility to take on apprentices. So it is the potential falconer's responsibility to be trying to prove that you have what it takes to really adopt this lifestyle. So I think that's pretty much what you look for, Butch. People that are putting forth the effort and showing that they're going to stick with
Exactly.
this.
I mean, I've sponsored quite a few people, and there was a handful that I didn't let them go through because they didn't have it in them, and
Yep.
that's the sponsor's responsibility to see that out. And if I just see that they just want a bird as a pet, or they don't have the time for it, I won't pass them through.
Hmm.
I'm all about the bird. I'm all about the bird's welfare.
Yep. Yep. So like Butch said, showing your commitment, making sure that you're showing welfare. You have all the required facilities and equipment. So we talked a lot about that and the time that goes in.
Yep.
And then you have to complete your license application. Once you pass the exam, you've achieved a sponsor that trusts you and is willing to support you, so pay your associated fees. Then the next thing you go through again in this rigorous process is the schedule and inspection with a game warden and officer that'll come out and make sure that you are meeting all the requirements. So this apprenticeship manual also covers a lot of those very specific checklist items. And then ultimately, once you're there, trap, train, and hunt your bird. And like I said, as an apprentice, it's really important to fly and hunt with the bird for at least 4 months each year so that you're getting that experience in. And then I just wanted to say, take diligent notes and records because you will forget certain things. And to Butch's point about weight management, when you're hunting the birds, you need to know exactly where they are, that they're motivated. And we'll get back to that here shortly. And then each year you have to be really responsible, complete your annual paperwork. To Butch's point about not allowing certain apprentices to move on, that's part of the apprentice report. And then you also have to report the game taken, like we talked about, and then pay your fees again. So I think you're getting a theme here that you have to really be dedicated, and there's a cost involved. Yeah. Yeah.
It's absolutely a lifestyle. It's not.
Yep.
I can't even call it a hobby. It's a lifestyle. It changes your life, and you've got to be willing to put forth the effort and the time to be a successful falconer.
Absolutely. Yep. You're not successful if you don't put the time in. And that's just a hard truth we all deal with. And we all grapple with it at some point because everybody gets busy. So
I've seen falconry ruin marriages.
so yeah, then training and hunting with raptors, I want to show you just a general overview of what birds we work with. So Butch mentioned the long wings, so falcons, so peregrines, prairie falcons, gyr falcons, American kestrels, and merlins. These are commonly flown in North America, and we'll see what's allowed in California here in just a bit. But I did want to point out, I mentioned sexual dimorphism earlier, but our American kestrels and our merlins are two of our smallest falcons in North America, and they're dimorphic not only in size, but also in color and pattern.
What's funny is, back in my day, when I flew long wings, it was either a peregrine or a prairie falcon, and now with the hybrids, you can get any combination of the three now. So I've never flown a hybrid bird before. So mine were either pure peregrine or they're pure prairie.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, so each species and each group of hawks and falcons is really has certain prey that they are, excel at. So like Butch mentioned,
Exactly.
A lot of long wings do relate with ducks and more feathered quarry, whereas things like red-tailed hawks and Harris's hawks do better with bird, but can also work with feathered quarry. And then we have our short wings, our true hawks, so they're known that they're traditionally forest hawks. They can go after a lot of feathered quarry, but a lot of folks use them for hunting rabbits, fur quarry worldwide, and especially in California too. So we recently had the American goshawk and the Eurasian goshawk were split from the northern goshawk. They're now two species. And then we also changed some designations around, and the only true accipiter anymore is our sharp-shinned hawk. So our Cooper's hawks and our American goshawks are actually in a different genus now. Doesn't really change what we do, but just a nice tidbit. And then we talked a lot already about red-tailed hawks and Harris's hawks. I won't belabor them here, but they're just awesome birds. So I wanted to chat a little bit about different classifications of falconry birds. So if we're thinking about wild-caught birds and we're using a Cooper's hawk for an example, we have our very young birds, so an IS or a young raptor, and that's essentially an unfledged nestling. And typically for falconry, we're taking a bird at that age, we're raising them as an imprint, so raised by humans. And I wish we had more time today to talk about that process, but it is one way that we acquire birds from the wild, is to actually take a nestling and then raise it as an imprint. And if we do part 2 of this talk ever, we'll talk about why that's really important or relevant for different hunting methods. But then the passage bird, so a wild bird in juvenile plumage, also called a passenger, means it's under a year old. It's in its juvenile plumage. It's just getting its feet wet, learning everything. And then a haggard bird is an adult, also known as a hag, meaning it's over a year old. And what I want to point out there is that in falconry, we do not take haggard birds, with one exception, to the American kestrels. And that's largely because those birds are part of the breeding population, so we don't really want to take from that. But they also are pretty set in their ways and often harder to train. The only reason that kestrel haggard birds are allowed to take is that sometimes it can be hard to age kestrels when we're catching them in the wild. But as Butch and I will both attest, we still want to try to take a passage bird, so we're not taking from the breeding population. And we're also getting a bird that's more amenable to working with us. So real quickly, wanted to touch on some of the benefits of a passage bird. So they have natural hunting skills because they're already out on their own. They're learning, or hopefully learning. They have more of a readiness to learn and train them faster because they are a young bird that's not set in their ways and is more amenable to working with a human. And then we also benefit that relationship in that about 80% of, I should say 80%, not 80, of passage raptors perish in their first year. They either starve, they don't have enough game, they can't learn fast enough to hunt on their own. And so that relationship that they develop with us, we can catch that bird, train it, and release it during the next migration or next season. And then that allows it to have a better chance of becoming part of that breeding population. And then we also
I'll add that as an apprentice falconer, you're only allowed to take a kestrel or a red-tailed hawk in the first 2 years of your apprenticeship, and those birds are always released at the end of the season. So you've given that bird a head start. Plus, you're going to get a new one in. So I make all my apprentices release their birds at the end of the first year.
Yeah, it really helps because you get a totally different experience. I did 3 kestrels over my apprenticeship.
Right.
Each bird was super different.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, our Harris's hawks are captive bred. And so you have 2 kind of flavors of captive bred birds you can get. An imprint, which we already talked about. You can get it from a breeder as a very young raptor, again, that you have as for a breeding program that was raised by human, or is ultimately going to be raised by humans for training. And then we also have our chamber raised birds, which is how Butch and I both have acquired our Harris's hawks. Those are essentially a passage bird, that they're that same age or a juvenile, but they were raised by their parents in a breeding chamber as part of a breeding program. And so certain species really, that benefits that we don't have bad behaviors if we get them at a age that they've been raised with their parents and they're just going into independence.
And a reputable breeder.
Absolutely. So not going to list every species here, but these are the species wild-caught species that are allowed in California. But I didn't mention on those commonly used slides, the red-shouldered, the barred owl and the great horned owl. And that's just because we are allowed to use them in falconry, but they're not as common. And then just real quickly, I know we're coming up on 7 o'clock, so I just want to keep an eye on the time. We trap the wild birds in a number of different methods, but if we're going for a species like a kestrel or a red-tailed hawk, something that doesn't come down in a pursuit in a stoop, we'll often use what's called a balchatri trap, which has a bunch of little monofilament nooses on usually like a metal screened mesh with some kind of prey item inside. So a gerbil, a mouse, a rat, whatever's appropriate for the particular bird. And just give you a quick look at what that looks like. This kestrel here is actually checking out this mouse. Mouse is completely safe. The kestrel will not actually get to it, but there's the nooses are hard to see. But as she's stepping on it, she gets caught. And then we can get in there quickly and get that bird off of the trap, make sure it's a passage bird, and then hopefully take that bird home. Another method of trapping, and this one is often used for things like merlins, other longwings. In this case, we'll see a prairie falcon that is going after a European starling. So European starlings are invasive in the U.S. We can use them to try to trap the birds. You see the two poles on the right and left, and then what's harder to see here, there's a net in between where the bird is hopefully going to attempt to get the starling, and then the starling on the other side of the net. So let's have a look at that. It's fast. So if you didn't see that, I will go back.
No.
And here it comes. In the net, falconer can again get in there and start to untangle it from the net. And then for Butch, it's a method that he's used quite a bit, especially back in the day, the pigeon harness or pigeon jock, which actually has, again, pigeons are a non-native invasive species in a lot of places around the world, but here in the US, and we can use them to help trap a bird and have just those same monofilament nooses tied to an actual harness that goes on the pigeon.
Yeah, back in the day, that was a very effective way of trapping longwing, red tails, you name it.
Yep. And then we could have a whole talk just about this. And if we ever are invited to do it again, I would love to cover each one of these steps in sequence. But these are the traditional steps that we usually follow for something like a red tail, a kestrel, a Harris's hawk, with minor differences based on whether it's captive bred, whether it's a wild bird. But we're kind of working through the same thing. So we have our manning process, which is the first box there on the left. And that manning is just getting the bird used to us, spending as much time with it sitting on our glove inside the house or in a calm area, getting it used to eating with us and trusting us. So I have the critical components down there for our training, and it's really, we'll get back to weight management, but trust and motivation. And that comes through manning and then also through the positive reinforcement that we work with as we're training. So once we have those in place and we focus on what Butch mentioned earlier about weight management, the bird is at a point where it needs to eat, it's hungry, it's not starving. I want to be very clear about that. I think that's one misnomer about falconry. Does not behoove us to starve our birds. We want healthy birds, but we do want our birds to be motivated. So a bird that has had a nice meal and is nice and fat is not going to be motivated to put in the work. So that's a big component of training, is making sure that the bird we're training at the time that works best to actually have that bird be motivated. So we want to look first to then see that the bird starts trusting us more and will jump or hop to the fist from its perch. And I have here that it's still tethered at that point. So we have a leash or a creance for the bird so that we make sure that it won't get away and hurt itself if it decides not to come to us. So we do that through some indoor flights, in the garage, maybe in the house, if possible. And then I have on the top the lure introduction and reinforcement. So we talked a lot about that lure. That's really what guarantees the birds that they're getting a nice full meal. When we're working on other training, we're just using small regimented amounts of food. When the bird sees the lure, they know they get that full meal. They're going to be rewarded greatly. So we start that lure introduction early on. Once we have some confidence built and we're starting to do flights, and as we transition to outside, and then that's one of the things that guarantees us if our bird does get away and decides it doesn't really want to work with us that day, that we can confidently call it back. So we throw that lure out, and they more often than not will come right down to it, because we all do have bad days. We have a lot more good days, but sometimes you have bad days. So ultimately, we want to make sure they're wed to that lure. So that's what I just described, that they confidently come to it. And then we start, and this is the part where every falconer gets really nervous when we move to free flights in the field, and then making sure you have that trust and confidence built up. And then ultimately, I have entering listed here, where we want to try to work with the bird for the appropriate quarry that we have in our area. So if you're working with quail, you want to go to places where you have abundant quail, rabbits, same thing, and making sure that they have many opportunities for that slip when the quarry actually takes off, and they have the opportunity to grab that in the field. And then once we're doing that, that's kind of tied in with hunting, but once we're really going with that and the bird knows what it's doing, we're out and running and hunting confidently. And this does differ. Long wings follow a little bit of a different process, but we still kind of look for some of the same things, the same milestones.
Exactly.
And then ultimately that results in a free flying bird that returns to you. So this was like the first time I was out with my bird, and he was up in the tree, and he came down to me, and I was ecstatic. So we repeated that many times afterward, because that first time you're not sure, but every time I saw him come back to this perch, which we don't need to talk about that because we don't have time, but Butch has opinions on the T perch there.
I'm not a big fan of that T perch, but I want to interject that every falconer at some point ends up in the field for hours because your bird won't come down. We've left birds out overnight and had to go back there first thing in the morning when they were hungry to bring them down, and that's all weight management. But it's a learning curve. You learn all that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. I've had some days where my bird has been, any of my birds, but especially my Harris's hawk, he's been a little more reluctant to get to work. But like I said, I've had a lot more good days than bad, so that's awesome, and I still have a bird. So once we tie all that together, just want to show you another perspective. This is work in Spain with a goshawk hunting rabbits alongside ferret and French Brittany's as hunting partners, which is really awesome when you can put all that together. So the Brittany's go in and they actually locate the rabbits, and then they use the ferrets to go into the holes, the burrows, and actually flush the rabbits out. We'll just watch it. It's a pretty brief video.
Most every falconer in the UK use ferrets.
Oh yeah, I know. I wish we were able to. So the French Brittany here, actually locating a rabbit in an active burrow. We got the goshawk sending in our ferrets. And then again, we're looking for that slip where the rabbit actually takes off, and it has that opportunity for the goshawk to grab the rabbit, which is right there. And you'll get to see it pursuing the rabbit. And then getting there, and one of our ultimate responsibilities is getting to that bird quickly. One, to protect it from other predators that may try to come and harm it or steal the food. But then ultimately, we work as a partnership with the bird. So we want to make sure we dispatch that quarry ethically and quickly. So we have a number of different methods to do that. The birds aren't necessarily interested in making sure the quarry is dead. So that is the responsibility of the falconer, as well as, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but part of our training process is actually getting the bird used to our approach. So this falconer was able to get right up to the bird, get his hand in there to dispatch the quarry. So they have to be comfortable with that. And then we also have a previously portioned amount of food ready to trade the Raptor So they will take that food that we have prepared for them, and then we actually will take the quarry and put it in our game bag and take it home for hawk food or food for us. But you have that ready to go. So that's tying it all together. And then I'm just going to breeze over these code of ethics, but we've talked a lot about responsibility and what falconers have to do in order to keep their birds healthy, but also be a responsible falconer to the public. So I do want to say we try not to draw undue or negative attention to our birds, keep everything in top condition for our birds' health and equipment so that we avoid any issues with losing a bird or having a bird injure itself. And then if we do recover a bird, we put all our effort in to make sure that we get it back. Or if we lose a bird, that we recover that lost bird. And then to Butch's earlier point, if you're training an apprentice falconer, they only get advanced to general if they follow the code and are doing things that they should. So we're a little bit over, but Butch, did you want to? I can talk through these if you want to grab your bird.
Sure.
Is that all right, Eric?
Absolutely.
We got till probably about 15 after. So if folks are able to stick around, we just have a quick show and tell. I'll talk here. Raptor recovery programs and outreach are really, really important. So there are many, many throughout the world, throughout the US. These are just examples of some of the ones that we have here in North America. The Peregrine Fund has been instrumental in work with condors and peregrine falcons for recovery actions for those species. And Butch, as we saw, he is a wildlife rehabber as well as a falconer. You don't have to be both, but Butch he's a man of many trades, and he does rehab. And so we were going to talk about the young raptors that they get in, as well as injured birds. But what's the story with our great horned owl here?
Well, so in my off season, my falconering off season, I spend all my time doing bird rehab, and we get, every year, even the great horned owls, we'll get 40, 50 of them in every season that have fallen from the nest or they're injured. This little guy here has a bad eye, cannot be released, and so he's going to be hopefully a ambassador bird to somebody here. I don't name him because I don't want to get attached to him, but he's a very, very good little owl. And we take in so many injured birds. I think Derek has a picture, but just this season alone, we had 4 peregrine falcons shot. The one in this picture right here actually had been shot twice. When we did the x-rays, we found an old bullet in her. And the second time she was shot in the wing. And luckily, she was able to be rehabbed, and she was our only releasable peregrine. The other 3, unfortunately, had to put down. And we get injured birds from gunshots constantly. I mean, I can't stress enough why people want to kill these beautiful birds. We had a beautiful red-shouldered hawk come in this week that's been shot. So, I mean, I can't stress enough to don't shoot hawks. Just, you can enjoy them, you can look at them, but there's no reason to hurt these birds.
Yep. And then if somebody were to find either a young bird, a young downy fledgling, or an injured bird, what do you typically recommend that they do?
So the best thing you can do, I even put a PSA on my Instagram, but there's a lot of owls that do not need to be rescued. If they're halfway feathered and they're on the ground, the parents are taking very good care of them. Of course, there's always a chance they're going to get taken by a coyote or a cat or a dog or something. But that's the circle of life, and we recommend people to leave those kind of owls alone. If you're getting the little downy chick, obviously pick it up, put it in a nice box, keep it closed, and call a rehabber. Call animal control. Animal control will get it to us, and so that's the right thing to do. But the older owls actually on the ground should be left alone.
Yep.
As long as they're out of danger. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then we have some final thoughts here, hopefully, and some questions. With anything we want to wrap up, but did want to say as we're moving into those questions, And this is just my Harris's hawk last year, giving a nice curious look. So he wants to know if you have any questions. But if you do have anything that you think is irresponsible, or somebody's behaving against any regulations that were talked about today, shooting a bird, doing any of those sorts of things, you can always call the tip line and put in an anonymous tip. So I don't know, Eric, if you have anything to add to that as our expert here.
Oh, please do that. Please do that.
Yeah, it's an anonymous tip, and it's anything fish and wildlife related, not just birds.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct. Yeah, we've made a lot of great cases through the CalTip line, and again, you can stay anonymous. You can even call or text the tip line, tip 411. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why game wardens become game wardens. They want to stop poaching and polluting.
Exactly.
And so I live to do that. That's why I became a game warden. And I lost sleep at night thinking about, okay, these guys are out poaching and they're shooting hawks. How can we catch them? So
Right.
your tips matter.
Yep. So hopefully we've given you a lot of really good information, just a nice introduction to why we do what we do, how we do it. You see that it is really a lifestyle. Hopefully we've inspired some of you to actually become a falconer. I really always like to share knowledge. So I really appreciate you guys being with us tonight. But do we have any questions that we're still burning that we need to address?
Mike is phenomenal. He's answering all the questions. He's doing
That's
just
awesome.
a fantastic job. I just want to read some of the comments. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Another one saying this was one of the best webinars yet. Thank you very much for sharing. Very cool. And I just want to echo that. It's just Butch, Derek, Mike, thank you so much for coming on to do this.
It was a pleasure.
You guys are a blessing to me and a blessing to the public. So thank you for serving us this way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're happy to. As we said, public outreach, we love it. And we do a fair share of it.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. And if anybody out there has questions, you can email me. I think everybody has my email address. And then if I don't know the answer, I know Mike does.
Nobody fact check.
All right, guys.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
You.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.